In a courtroom built for truth, my own half-brother stood up and called me a thief. He said I had stolen our father's signature with a steady hand and a guilty heart. He said I had tricked a dying old man into signing away a life he had spent 40 years building. The same dying old man who had asked for my hand on his last night, who had not seen my brother's face in almost 2 years. Then the judge set down his pen, looked across the room at the man wearing my last name, and the silence that followed felt sharper than any word that had been said before it. If you have ever been accused of something you did not do by someone who shares your blood, stay close to me through this story, because the worst part was never the accusation itself. The worst part was watching how many people in our family wanted to believe him. So before I tell you what the judge said next, I want you to ask yourself one quiet question. If your own family stood in front of strangers and called you a liar, would you still try to keep the peace, or would you finally let the truth speak louder than your fear of losing them? My name is Ackles, and 3 years before that courtroom, I was a 32-year-old woman holding a phone in a parking lot, listening to a doctor say the word pancreatic the way people say the word storm. My father was on the other line. He was 68, a stubborn man with grease under his fingernails in a small auto parts shop on the edge of a town called Glen Hollow. He had built that shop with his own hands, and he had buried my mother 11 years before this call. I remember the way he tried to make it sound small. He said the doctors had found something. He said it might be nothing. He said maybe I should not bother coming. He said all of that, and then he asked me very quietly if I could be there by Friday. That is how I knew it was not nothing. That is how I knew the next part of my life was already starting, even if no one had told me yet. I drove home the next morning. Home was a 2-bedroom house with a green roof and a porch that always needed sweeping. Dad was sitting on that porch when I pulled up, and he looked smaller than the last time I had seen him, like the news had taken something out of him before the disease even had a chance. We did not hug right away. We never did. He just nodded and said the coffee was inside. That night we sat at the kitchen table and we talked about the cancer like it was a problem with a truck engine. Stage 3, surgery would not help. Chemotherapy might give him months, maybe a little more if he was lucky. He said the word lucky like it tasted strange. Then he asked about my brother, my half-brother. He asked if I would call him. I have to tell you about Bryce now, because the rest of the story does not make sense without him. Bryce was my father's son from a first marriage that ended before I was born. He was 6 years older than me. Our father had tried to be in his life, but Bryce's mother had moved across the country and the visits had become rare, then thin, then almost nothing. By the time Dad married my mother, Bryce was already a teenager who saw our father as a part-time guest. There was no real bond there, only the bond of paperwork and last name. Bryce became a man who lived in a glass apartment in a city 3 states away, who worked in finance, who wore expensive shoes, and who came home maybe twice a year for a meal he barely ate. He had a wife named Marisol. Marisol came from money, or she said she did, and she carried herself like a woman who had decided early that this small town was beneath her. They had no children. They had a dog they treated like a child. They had a life made of photos for other people to look at, and very little time for the rest of us. I called Bryce the next morning. I told him about the diagnosis. I told him the doctors did not give Dad much time. I told him our father had asked about him. There was a long pause, and then Bryce told me he was on a deadline at work, that he had a trip to Spain already booked with Marisol, and that he would try to come for Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was 4 months away. I remember standing in my father's kitchen with the phone pressed against my ear, and I remember not saying any of the things I wanted to say. I remember just nodding, even though he could not see me, and saying the word fine. That word would haunt me later. Fine was the word I used for almost 3 years. Fine was the word I used while the world quietly fell on my shoulders and Bryce went on with his life like nothing had changed at all. I moved into Dad's house the following week. I did not call it moving in. I told myself it was temporary. I left my apartment in the city, paid 2 months ahead so I could think, and I packed 2 suitcases and a box of books. The box of books is still in his garage. I never finished unpacking. There was no time. From the day I walked through that door, my life turned into a schedule of medicine bottles, hospital trips, scan dates, insurance phone calls, and the slow learning of how to lift a man twice your weight when his legs do not work the way they used to. Kane Auto Parts, the small shop my father had built, did not run itself. So during the day I went to the shop, and at night I came home and made soup he could not always keep down, and in the dark hours I sat by the bed and I listened to him breathe. His old business partner, Greg, helped me with the shop. Greg was 62 and had been my father's friend since they were both 20-year-olds with nothing but tools. Greg never said the word cancer. Greg just showed up earlier and stayed later. Dale, who was 24 and had only worked for us 6 months, took on more inventory work than he was paid for. They were the people who carried me through that first year. They are also the people Bryce never thanked, even once, for keeping our father's name above the door while our father was dying inside it. Bryce came home for 2 days at Thanksgiving. He brought Marisol. Marisol wore white pants in a house full of medical equipment and asked me 3 times if there was anything to drink that was not from a bottle with a price under $20. Bryce sat with our father for maybe 40 minutes that whole visit. Most of the time he was on his phone in the driveway. He told me before he left that I should think about putting Dad in a facility because, in his words, this was not sustainable. He said it like he was offering business advice. Then he hugged our father stiffly, kissed our father's forehead like he was checking the temperature, and got into a black rental car and drove away. He came back twice in the next 2 years, once for 36 hours, once for a single afternoon. Both times he asked me when, not how Dad was, but when did the doctors think? When was the next scan? When would things be settled? There was a moment, near the end of that first year, when our father sat me down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen. He said it was time to talk about what came next. He told me he had thought about it for a long time. He told me he wanted me to take over Kane Auto Parts. He told me he wanted me to live in this house. He told me he wanted his savings, the small amount of stock he had inherited from his own father, and the money he had set aside in a retirement account to come to me. He said Bryce had been given help in his 20s when our father had paid off Bryce's first car loan and helped Bryce with the down payment on a condo. He said Bryce had not used those gifts well. He said Bryce had a wife who treated us like inconvenient relatives. He said Bryce had not earned the right to inherit a life he had refused to be part of. He said all of this with steady eyes, and then he asked me to call Mr. Halloran, the family lawyer, and set up a meeting. Mr. Halloran was a quiet man with reading glasses that lived on the tip of his nose. He had been our family attorney for as long as I could remember. He had handled my mother's affairs after she passed. My father trusted him the way he trusted Greg. The day we met him, my father insisted on driving himself, even though I made him let me sit in the driver's seat. Mr. Halloran did not rush him. He asked him many careful questions. He asked him if anyone was pressuring him. He asked him if he understood the meaning of every part of the will. He asked him if he wanted to provide for Bryce in any way. My father thought about that for a long time, and then he said yes. He said Bryce was still his son. He said he wanted Bryce to receive a sum of money that he named, plus a piece of jewelry that had been my grandfather's. He said Bryce had not earned more than that, and he said he was not going to pretend otherwise. Mr. Halloran wrote everything down. Then he said something that turned out to matter more than anything else. Mr. Halloran said that, given the family situation, he wanted my father to record a video. A short, simple video. Sitting in his own home in his own clothes with 2 witnesses present, explaining in his own words why he had made the choices he had made. My father agreed without hesitation. He told Mr. Halloran he had nothing to hide. He told him he was not afraid of his own son. He told him that if his son ever had questions, he wanted his son to hear the answers from his own mouth. We did the recording 2 weeks later. We did it in the living room with the green chair he liked and the photo of my mother on the table behind him. He wore a clean shirt. He sat up straight. He said his name and his date of birth and the date of recording. He said with full clarity what he wanted to happen with everything he owned. He named me. He named Bryce. He explained why. He looked into the camera and said that if anyone ever tried to claim he had been confused or pressured, that person should remember he had said these words on this day, looking into a lens at the age of 69 with his mind clear. Then he said one more thing. He said he loved both his children. He said he was proud of one of them. He did not say which one. He did not have to. The man who eventually watched that recording in a courtroom understood it the moment my father opened his mouth. The next year passed slowly and quickly at the same time, the way hard years do. My father got smaller, then he got tired, then he started forgetting which day it was but never which person was sitting next to him. He had moments of full clarity all the way to the end. He had a hospice nurse named Mrs. Patel who came 3 times a week, then 5, then every day. Mrs. Patel kept careful notes. She wrote down his lucid moments, his pain levels, his food intake, his conversations. Mrs. Patel was a quiet, kind woman from Trinidad who had been a hospice nurse for 19 years. She told me more than once that my father was one of the most clear-headed dying men she had ever cared for. She told me he spoke about me often. She told me he never spoke about Bryce except to ask if Bryce had called. The number of times Bryce had called my father in his final 6 months was 4. I checked the phone records later when I had to. 4 calls. 3 of them under 3 minutes. One of them lasted 7 minutes, and during that one Marisol had taken the phone from Bryce in the middle to ask my father whether he had updated his will to include any property transfers because she said she just wanted to be sure everything was in order. My father said yes, he had updated it, and yes, everything was in order, and then he handed the phone to me and asked me to end the call. I ended it. The night my father died, I was holding his hand. Mrs. Patel was on the other side of the bed. The lamp was low. He had not eaten in 3 days. He had not spoken much in 2. But around midnight, he opened his eyes and he looked at me and he said my name. He said it like he was making sure I was there. I told him I was. He squeezed my hand once very softly and then he closed his eye. He passed about an hour later. Mrs. Patel marked the time. I sat there for a while. I did not cry yet. I called Greg first because Greg had been waiting. Then I called Aunt Linda, my father's younger sister who lived 2 towns over. Then a long time after I called Bryce. He did not pick up. I left a voicemail telling him our father had died. He called back 9 hours later when his alarm in the city had gone off. He said he was sorry. He asked when the funeral was. He asked one more thing in that call. He asked if our father had said anything before the end. I told him our father had said my name. There was a pause, then Bryce hung up. The funeral was small. Glen Hollow is the kind of town where the funeral home is run by a family who has been there for 4 generations. We had the service in the chapel. Greg spoke. Aunt Linda spoke. Mrs. Patel sat in the 3rd row in a dark blue dress and cried quietly. Bryce arrived 10 minutes before the service. Marisol arrived with him. She wore a black coat with fur trim and sunglasses she did not take off inside the chapel. They sat in the front row beside me. They did not speak to me. They did not speak to Aunt Linda. Bryce did not stand up to say anything during the service. When it was time to go to the cemetery, Bryce drove behind us in his rental car and arrived a full 10 minutes after the rest of us. He stood beside the grave with one hand in his pocket. He left before the dirt was finished. I have never told anyone this, but as the funeral home director closed the metal gate behind the last of the cars, I caught Marisol leaning toward Bryce and asking him, in a voice she did not bother to lower when exactly the will reading was scheduled. That was when something inside me went very quiet. That was the moment I think the rest of this story really began. Mr. Halloran scheduled the will reading for the following Tuesday. Bryce flew back home in the meantime. He did not stay. He told me he had work. He came back on Monday night and stayed at a hotel just outside town, even though our father's house was empty and had 2 extra bedrooms. The reading happened in Mr. Halloran's office on Main Street in a small conference room with green carpet and one window. Aunt Linda came. Bryce came. Marisol came, even though she was not named in the will. Greg came as a witness. I came in the same black dress I had worn to the funeral because I had not had time to wash it yet. Mr. Halloran read the will out loud. He read it slowly. He read every clause. He read the part where my father named me as the primary heir of Kane Auto Parts and the family home and the savings. He read the part where my father gave Bryce a sum of $70,000 and a gold pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather. He read every word with the patience of a man who had done this for 40 years and knew exactly how this kind of room could turn. Bryce did not let him finish. Halfway through the second reading of the bequest list, Bryce stood up. He told Mr. Halloran the will could not possibly be real. He said it had to be a forgery. He said our father would never in his right mind leave him only $70,000 and a watch when there was, in his words, a business and a house and a fortune at stake. He said I had clearly manipulated a sick old man. He said the signature looked off. He said the language was off. He said he wanted everything pulled, that he would be challenging it, that he would be hiring a lawyer that very afternoon. Marisol, beside him, was already typing on her phone, and I learned later she had been searching for estate litigation attorneys before our father's casket had even been fully covered. Aunt Linda turned white. Greg stood up. Mr. Halloran stayed perfectly still. He told Bryce in a level voice that he had personally drafted the will, personally watched our father sign it, that there had been 2 witnesses besides himself, that there was a video recording, and that any challenge would be answered fully when the time came. Bryce called him a liar. He called me a thief. He left the room and slammed the door so hard the framed certificate on Mr. Halloran's wall tilted on its nail. I sat there. I did not move. I could not. Aunt Linda put her hand on top of mine and I could feel that her hand was shaking. Mr. Halloran finished reading the will. He told me that he would be there when I needed him. He told Greg, who was still standing, that things would now most likely become difficult. He was right. 3 days later, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my front door. The envelope had the name of a city law firm on it. The firm represented Bryce. The papers inside accused me of forgery, of undue influence, of elder abuse, and of fraud. They named me in 7 different ways. They asked the court to throw out the will. They asked for an emergency freeze on the estate. They asked for the house to be placed into a trust supervised by my brother. They asked, in plain words, for everything our father had left me to be taken away. I sat on the steps of that house, the house I had lived in since I was 4 years old, and I read those papers twice. The second time I read them, I noticed something. The lawyer who had signed them was not from Glen Hollow. He was from the city where Bryce lived. His name was Vance Crane. The firm was the kind of firm that takes pictures of itself in front of glass towers. I looked them up. They were expensive. Bryce was using a top-shelf city firm. I knew in that moment that Bryce was not going to walk away. He had paid real money up front. That meant he was sure of something. I thought for a long time about what he could be sure of. Then I understood. He was not sure of his case. He was sure of me. He was sure I would crumble. He was sure I would settle. He was sure that after everything I had carried in those 3 years, I would not have the strength to stand up in a courtroom and fight my own family in public. He thought I would pay him to go away. He did not know that I had already promised our father I would not. The next 2 months turned into a strange kind of war. Aunt Linda found me a lawyer named Ms. Reeve. Ms. Reeve was 45, soft-voiced, and made of stone. She had handled inheritance disputes for 20 years. She was the kind of woman who looked you in the eye and told you in the first meeting exactly what your case was worth and exactly what you would have to live through to win it. She read the complaint Bryce had filed. She read it very slowly. Then she set it down and she asked me one question. She asked me how strong my proof was. I told her about the video. I told her about Mr. Halloran's notes. I told her about Mrs. Patel's records. I told her about the calls Bryce had not made, the visits he had not made, the money I had personally spent caring for our father, the receipts I had kept because I had grown up watching my father keep receipts for everything. Ms. Reeve listened. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and she said one sentence I have never forgot. She said, "You are going to win this, but you are going to have to be willing to let your brother destroy himself in public to do it." She asked me if I could live with that. I sat with that question for a long time, then I said yes. I told her I had already lived with worse. The discovery process began. That is the part of a lawsuit where each side has to hand over their evidence. Bryce's lawyer, Vance Crane, demanded everything from me. He demanded my bank statements going back 4 years. He demanded my tax returns. He demanded my texts with my father, my texts with Mrs. Patel, my texts with Greg, my emails, my phone records, my credit card statements, my medical records, and a list of every doctor I had ever seen. Ms. Reeve told me they were not looking for proof, they were looking for embarrassment. They wanted to find one thing they could use to make me look unstable, dishonest, or shady in front of a judge. I gave them everything. I had nothing to hide. The hardest part was reading my own 3 years back to myself in cold paper. 3 years of grocery store receipts for soft foods. 3 years of pharmacy charges. 3 years of late-night gas station coffees on the way to and from the hospital. 3 years of one income, mine, paying for medications insurance would not cover and the small repairs the house needed, and the parts the shop ran short on. There was a row of 128 charges over those 3 years that read pharmacy. There was no row of charges that read flight from Bryce. We made our own discovery requests, too. Ms. Reeve asked for Bryce's financial records. She asked for them because Vance Crane had argued in his complaint that Bryce was a successful businessman with no need to falsely accuse his sister, that this was simply about justice for his late father. Ms. Reeve wanted to know if that was true. The records came in slowly. They had to be ordered through a court process. Vance Crane fought hard, but they came. And when they came, my lawyer's office called me into a back conference room and told me to sit down. Bryce's finances were a wreck. Marisol's finances were worse. They had taken out loans against their condo. They had 2 credit cards in default. Bryce had been laid off from his finance job 7 months earlier and had not told anyone in our family. He was, on paper, on the edge of bankruptcy. Marisol had been hiding charges from a private club that cost more per year than my father had earned in 2. They were drowning. The day our father died, they were already 3 missed payments away from losing their car. The day Bryce stood up at the will reading and called me a thief, he was a man who needed our father's estate the way a swimmer in cold water needs a rope. I want to be honest. When I read those records, my first feeling was not satisfaction. My first feeling was sad. I sat in Ms. Reeve's conference room and I thought about a boy I had only really known through old photos, a boy who had once stood in a yard with our father holding up a fish. I thought about how easy it would have been for our father to give Bryce more if Bryce had been there. I thought about all the men I knew who had gotten themselves into money trouble and been able to ask for help and receive it, and I thought about how Bryce had chosen instead to ask for help by suing his only sister. I sat there for a while and then I told Ms. Reeve to keep going. I told her we were not stopping. I told her that pity is not an excuse to lie about a dead father in court. I told her Bryce had picked this fight on the day my father was buried, and I would not be the one to call it off. The settlement offer came 2 weeks before the trial. Vance Crane sent it through Ms. Reeve. Bryce was offering to drop the lawsuit if I gave him 60% of the estate. He framed it as a compromise. He said it was less than the half he was, in his words, owed by family fairness. He said it was a way for everyone to move on without dragging our father's name through a public hearing. Ms. Reeve read it to me on the phone. She paused at the end and asked me what I wanted to say back. I thought about it for less than a minute. I told her to tell Vance Crane that my father had recorded a video for a reason. I told her to tell Vance Crane that we would see him in court. Then I hung up and I went back to my father's shop and I closed out the day's books and I locked the front door and I drove home through a town that had buried my father 2 months earlier, and I told myself out loud in the empty car that I was not going to break. That promise was the only thing I made out loud to myself in those weeks. I have kept it since. The week before the trial, the pressure from the family came in. Aunt Linda was on my side, but Aunt Linda was the only one of my father's siblings who was. My father had a brother named Carl who lived 3 hours north, and Carl had 2 grown sons named Theo and Theo and Marcus called me separately on the same Tuesday. They both said roughly the same thing. They both said that this was tearing the family apart. They both said that Bryce was hurting too. They both said that maybe, for the sake of our late grandparents, I should just give Bryce more so we could all go to Christmas together again. Theo went a little further. He told me that if I cared about Dad's memory, I would not let strangers and lawyers fight about him. He said it like he was being kind. He was not being kind. He was telling me in the polite tone our family used that my pain was less important than the family's comfort, and that I was the one expected to bend. I listened to both of them. I thanked them for calling. I told them I would not be giving brick. More, I told them I had a video of my father saying exactly what he wanted and that they were welcome to come to the courtroom and watch their uncle speak from the grave if they doubted me. Neither of them came. Marisol started a quiet campaign on social media. She did not name me. She did not have to. She posted long captions about how grief reveals who people really are. She posted about toxic siblings. She posted about family members who use a parent's illness for personal gain. She posted a photo of my father from a Christmas 8 years ago and wrote about how some people had not deserved his kindness. People in my old high school class, women I had not heard from in years, started messaging me. Some of them asked if I was okay in a tone that meant they had already decided I was not. Some of them sent screenshots. Some of them just disappeared from my life. I did not respond to any of it. Ms. Reeve had told me very early that anything I said online would be brought into the courtroom. So I said nothing online. I let Marisol fill the silence with whatever she wanted. I told myself every time my hand reached for my phone that the only audience I needed to convince was a judge who had never heard our names before in his life. The day of trial came in late autumn. The leaves outside the courthouse were brown and red, and a cold wind kept pulling them across the steps. Aunt Linda picked me up that morning. She wore a dark green dress and her wedding ring, even though her husband had been gone almost 12 years. She held my hand in the parking lot before we walked in. She told me that she was proud of me. She told me my father would have been proud of me. She told me to remember that the truth did not need to shout. I wore a navy blue suit and the small gold cross my mother had given me when I turned 10. We walked into that courtroom together. Greg was already inside. Mrs. Patel was already inside. Mr. Halloran was already inside. 2 of my dad's old customers from the shop were inside, sitting near the back in clean shirts and clean shoes, men who had known my father for 30 years and had come without being asked. On the other side, Bryce sat at the plaintiff's table beside Vance Crane in a dark gray suit. Marisol sat in the second row. She wore a black blouse. She did not look at me. Bryce did not look at me either. Vance Crane opened the trial with a long story. He told the judge about a son who had loved his father from far away. He told a story about a man whose career in the city had taken him from his small town but whose heart had always remained with his family. He told a story about a sister who had stayed at home, had grown bitter over time, had taken advantage of a sick old man, and had used 3 years of caregiving as a tool to slowly turn that old man against his own son. He used the word manipulation 7 times in his opening. He said the word forgery 4 times. He said the word vulnerable about my father 6 times. He told the judge that the will, the videos, and the witnesses were all the products of a careful campaign and that Bryce was simply asking the court to restore justice. He did all of this without ever looking at me directly. When he finished, he sat down. The judge's name was Judge Eisen. He was a man in his 60s with white hair and steady, tired eyes. He listened to Vance Crane without expression. Then he looked at Ms. Reeve and asked if she had an opening. Ms. Reeve stood up. Ms. Reeve did not tell a story. She told a structure. She told the judge that over the next 2 days he was going to hear directly from the attorney who had drafted the will, the hospice nurse who had cared for my father, a forensic document examiner who had inspected the signature, and my father himself on a recording he had made of his own free will and in his own clear mind. She said the case was not a question of feeling. It was a question of evidence. She said the plaintiff had filed a serious accusation, the accusation of forgery, which was a charge that could ruin my reputation in this town for the rest of my life. She said she was prepared to disprove every single piece of that accusation. She said it without raising her voice. She sat down. The judge nodded. He told Vance Crane to call his first witness. Vance Crane called Bryce. Bryce took the stand. He swore on a Bible he had not opened in years. He told a story that did not match any of the documents that already existed, but that was so well rehearsed he made it sound like he had lived it. He said our father had begun to seem confused in the last year. He said our father had told him on more than one phone call that Bryce was the favorite. He said he had been, in his words, blocked from fully participating in our father's care because I, his sister, had taken control of every detail and had pushed him out. He said I had not invited him to medical appointments. He said I had not given him updates. He said I had hidden her father's true wishes from him. He said he had only learned of the will at the reading and had been so shocked by the unfairness of it that he had been forced to take action. He looked, when he said this, like a man wearing grief he had borrowed from a closet. He looked, the whole time, like he was trying not to look at me. Ms. Reeve waited her turn. When she stood up to cross-examine, she carried a small folder with her. She walked up calmly. Then, one piece at a time, she dismantled him. She asked him how many times he had visited our father in the year before our father's death. He said many times. She asked him to be more specific. He said maybe a dozen. She pulled out hotel records, flight records, and credit card statements his own lawyer had provided in discovery. She showed the judge that in the year before our father's death, Bryce had been in Glen Hollow exactly twice for a total of 3 days. She asked him how many times he had called our father. He said constantly. She pulled out the phone records. The total number of calls in 12 months was 19. The total time on the phone was under 2 hours. She asked him to confirm he had said our father seemed confused. He said yes. She asked him whether he was qualified to assess medical confusion. He said no. She asked if any doctor had ever diagnosed our father with confusion. He said he did not know. She produced a letter from our father's oncologist stating that 3 weeks before signing the will, our father had been examined and was found to be of sound mind, fully oriented, and capable of making medical and legal decisions. The letter was signed and dated. Bryce had no answer for it. Then Ms. Reeve asked him if he had been in contact with our father in the last 6 months of his life. He said yes, often. She asked him what they had talked about. He said many things, family things. She asked if he could remember any specific conversation. He paused. He named a few topics that sounded vague. Then she asked him a question that landed harder than I expected. She asked him whether in any of those calls he had ever asked our father about updating the will. He hesitated. He said he had not. Ms. Reeve very calmly pulled out a transcript of a recorded phone call. The call had been recorded by our father with his own knowledge on a small device Mr. Halloran had given him for his protection. In that call, Marisol could be heard asking my father whether the will had been updated to include any property transfers. Bryce's voice was on the same call. Bryce's voice was the voice that had asked, near the end, whether there had been any changes about the house. Ms. Reeve read it out loud. She let the judge see it. She let Bryce see it. She set it down on the rail in front of him and asked him again if he wanted to revise his answer. He said he had forgotten. He said he must have misspoken. He looked in that moment like a man who had just realized there was a hole in the floor under his chair. Mrs. Patel testified next. She had brought her notebook. Mrs. Patel had been a hospice nurse for 19 years and she had testified in court 3 times before this one. She did not get rattled. Vance Crane tried to suggest gently that an exhausted dying man might say things he did not mean. Mrs. Patel told him plainly that my father had been one of the clearest patients she had ever cared for. She told him my father had spoken about his children many times. She told him that he had specifically told her on multiple occasions that he wanted his daughter to inherit the home, the business, and the savings. She told him my father had also said more than once that he loved his son but that he did not trust his son's wife, and that he was concerned that anything left to his son in the form of property would, in his words, end up in someone else's hands within a year. Vance Crane tried to object. The judge let her finish. She said it without anger. She said it the way a nurse says a temperature. Mr. Halloran testified after Mrs. Patel. He explained step by step how he had drafted the will. He explained that he had asked our father every required question. He explained that there had been 2 witnesses present beyond himself. He explained that the will had been signed in his office in front of him with the witnesses watching. He explained that the same procedure had been followed for the power of attorney and the business transfer documents. He explained that he had asked our father on 3 separate occasions, in writing and verbally, whether anyone was pressuring him. He explained that our father had said each time that no one was pressuring him and that he would have laughed at the idea that anyone could. Vance Crane tried to suggest the witnesses might have been biased. Mr. Halloran replied mildly that one of the witnesses was a court reporter from the next office over, and the other was Mr. Halloran's own legal assistant. Whom had ever met me before that day? Vance Crane sat back down. He had been losing for half an hour and now even his clothes seemed to know it. Then came the document examiner. Her name was Dr. Aldia, and she was a forensic specialist from a state lab. She had worked on signature comparison for over 30 years. She had compared my father's signature on the will to 19 examples of his signature taken from documents over the previous 15 years, including his old driver's license, his shop bank account paperwork, his tax returns, and 3 letters he had handwritten. She showed the judge enlarged images. She pointed to the loops of his W. She pointed to the slant. She pointed to the pressure marks. She walked the judge through the small repeating signs that show a hand has been making the same shapes for decades. Then she gave her conclusion. The signature on the will was his. The signature on the power of attorney was his. The signature on the business transfer was his. There was no evidence of forgery. There was no evidence of tracing. There was no evidence of a guided hand. Vance Crane had no questions for her. He had nothing to say. Then Ms. Reeve asked the court for permission to play a video. The judge nodded. The light stayed on. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered, and there, larger than life, was my father. He was sitting in his own green chair. He was wearing the blue plaid shirt he had worn most weekends. He was clean-shaven. The photograph of my mother was on the table behind him, just where it had always been. He stated his full name. He stated his date of birth. He stated the date. Then he looked into the camera and he spoke slowly and clearly for almost 6 minutes. He said why he had built the shop. He said why he had bought the house. He said why he had saved the money. He named me. He said he was leaving everything to me because I had stayed. He named Bryce. He said he loved Bryce. He said he was leaving Bryce a sum of money and a watch that had belonged to my grandfather. He said it was not because Bryce was less his son. He said it was because Bryce had not been part of building any of these things, and because he believed Bryce's wife would spend the rest in less than a year. He said, looking into the lens, that if anyone ever tried to claim he had been confused or pressured, they should remember he had said all of this on this day in his own home in his own clean shirt, looking right at them. Then he said one last thing. He said he wanted his son to find his way without a windfall. He said he hoped his son would not waste the small inheritance on appearances. He said he loved both his children. He said goodbye. The video ended. The courtroom for one long moment did not breathe. I did not look at Bryce while the video played. I looked at the screen. I watched my father's eyes the way I had watched them in his last weeks, looking for the moments he was clearest. He was clear in this video. There was no room for argument. When the screen went dark, I finally let myself glance over at him. Bryce was sitting very still. His shoulders had dropped about an inch. His face had lost the careful expression his lawyer had built for him. Marisol in the second row was no longer looking at her phone. She was looking at the carpet. Ms. Reeve recalled Bryce to the stand. The judge allowed it. Bryce walked back up slowly. Ms. Reeve did not waste a question. She asked him whether he had any debts at the time he filed the lawsuit. He hesitated. She asked again. He said he did. She asked the amount. He gave a small number. She produced his own bank records, the ones his lawyer had provided in discovery. The number was almost 10 times what he had said. She asked him if he had been laid off from his finance job 7 months before our father's death. He said yes. She asked him if he had told our father. He said no. She asked him if he had told me. He said no. She asked him what he had been planning to do about his debts before our father had passed. He said he had been working on it. She asked him whether the timing of his lawsuit, filed less than 72 hours after the will reading, suggested that he had been counting on a different inheritance to solve his financial problems. He did not answer for a long time. Vance Crane objected. The judge let the question stand. Bryce finally said no. Ms. Reeve sat down without another word. She had let him answer. The answer had been louder than the question. That was when Judge Eisen set down his pen. I had been watching that pen for 2 days. He had been taking small, careful notes. He had paused his pen many times during testimony, but he had never actually put it down. He set it down when Bryce stepped back from the stand. He set it down with a soft click on the wood of the bench, and the courtroom went very still. He removed his glasses. He looked at Vance Crane, then he looked at Bryce, then he looked for what felt like a very long time at the dark screen where my father's face had been. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and very plain. He said he had heard many estate cases over the years. He said he had heard families pull each other apart in his courtroom for sums of money far smaller than this one. He said he had seen lawyers try to dress weak cases in expensive clothes. He said he had also seen, on rare occasions, a case in which the deceased had taken the time while alive to speak his own mind so clearly that no living person had any right to claim otherwise. He said this was one of those cases. He said he was not going to pretend he had any doubts. He said the will was valid. He said the power of attorney was valid. He said the business transfer was valid. He said the forgery accusation was not only unsupported by evidence, it was directly contradicted by every piece of evidence in front of him. Then he turned slowly to Bryce. He said that filing a forgery accusation against a sibling in a case like this one was not a small thing. He said it had cost a working woman months of her time, large sums of money in legal fees, and damage to her reputation that the court could not fully repair. He said that he was therefore granting the defense's request for sanctions and for the recovery of attorney's fees in full. He said that he was also, in his ruling, including a finding that the lawsuit had been brought in bad faith. He said the court would issue a written order within the week, but that the matter before him was concluded. He picked up his pen again. He wrote one short paragraph. He signed it. He banged the gavel once. Then he stood and he left the bench, and the courtroom slowly, quietly came back to life. Bryce did not stand right away. Vance Crane began packing up his folders without speaking to him. Marisol was still staring at the carpet. Aunt Linda was crying very softly beside me, and Greg was holding the back of my chair, and Mrs. Patel had her hand on her own heart. I sat there. I did not move. I did not stand up to celebrate. I did not look at my brother and smile. I just breathed. For 3 years, while my father was sick, I had not really breathed. For 2 more months, while the lawsuit had hung over me, I had not really breathed. I sat there and I let the air come back into my chest, and I thought about my father in his green chair, and the photograph of my mother behind him, and the blue plaid shirt, and the words he had spoken into a camera so that 2 years later his only daughter would not have to fight a stranger's lawyer alone. Bryce finally stood. He turned very slowly toward me. He opened his mouth. I do not know what he was going to say because Aunt Linda stood up first. She did not yell. Aunt Linda has never yelled in her life. She just looked at him and she said in a low, even voice that he had buried his father twice this week, once at the cemetery and once in this room, and that she did not want to see his face at any family gathering for as long as she lived. Then she took my arm and we walked out together. Greg followed. Mrs. Patel followed. Mr. Halloran nodded once at me as we passed and did not say a word. Vance Crane was talking quickly to Bryce by then in the low tone lawyers use when they are about to send a final invoice. Marisol had stood up but had not moved toward Bryce. She was looking out the window of the courtroom. I think she had already started planning her exit by then. I would not be surprised at all. The drive home was quiet. The sky had gone that low gray color it gets in late autumn when the rain has not started yet but is coming. Aunt Linda did not talk. She just held the steering wheel and every now and then she squeezed my hand. We stopped at a small roadside place that sold pies and coffee. We did not eat anything. We sat across from each other in a booth. After a long time, she said something I have thought about many times since. She said that some families confuse loyalty with silence. She said that for years, our family had asked me to be loyal by being silent. She said today, by telling the truth, I had finally been loyal in the right direction. I had been loyal to my father. I had been loyal to myself. She said the rest of them could catch up or not. She said either way, she was on my side. I did not answer her with words. I just put my hand on top of hers across the table and we sat like that for a while and I let myself feel the size of what had just happened. The aftermath was not loud, but it was steady. The judge's written order arrived 2 days later. The forgery claim was dismissed with prejudice, which means Bryce was barred from ever filing it again. The court ordered Bryce to pay my legal fees, which were not small. He was also ordered to pay sanctions on top. The sanctions were a number that, given what I had seen of his finances, he could not pay without selling something. Within a month, his condo went up for sale. Within TW. Oh, it was sold. Marisol by then had quietly removed every photo of Bryce from her social media. She left him formally before Christmas. She wrote a long post about reclaiming her peace. She did not mention the lawsuit. She did not mention me. She did not have to. People in our extended family read between the lines. Theo and Marcus, the cousins who had told me to be a peacemaker, both called within a few weeks to apologize. Theo apologized first. He said he had not understood what really happened. He said he should have asked more questions before taking sides. Marcus's apology was less clean. He said he had been told a different story, as if having been told something was the same as having checked it. I thanked them. I told them I appreciated the apology. I did not invite them to Sunday dinner. I do not, even now. I have learned that some apologies are meant to be received and not used as a key back into a place you have already locked. The shop did not collapse. I think Bryce had counted on it collapsing. He had assumed that without our father, Kane Auto Parts would lose its customers, that I would be overwhelmed, that I would have to sell. He was wrong. Greg stayed, Dale stayed. We hired a third mechanic in the spring, a young woman named Lucia who had done 2 tours in the Navy before learning to fix engines. We added a new line of parts for older trucks, a category our father had been afraid to expand into because he had been getting older and slower. Within a year, our revenue was up almost 20%. Within 18 months, I was able to repaint the front of the building and put up a new sign that read Kane Auto Parts, and underneath it in smaller letters, since 1982, third generation owned. I did not change the name. People asked me if I would. I did not. The name was my father's. He had earned it. I was only carrying it forward. About 6 months after the trial, Bryce called me. I almost did not pick up. I had not heard his voice since the day of the verdict. I saw his name on the screen, and for a second the old part of me, the part that had grown up wanting an older brother, almost answered. The part of me that had buried our father answered instead. He spoke first. He told me he had hit a hard place. He told me Marisol had left, that the condo had sold for less than he had hoped, that he was renting a room in another man's apartment and had taken a job at a financial firm with a starting salary that hurt his pride to even say out loud. He told me he was sorry for what he had done. He used the word sorry. He used it the way some men use it, like it was a final payment. Then, in the same call with no real space between the apology and the request, he asked me if I would consider lending him some money. He used the word lending. He said he was good for it. He said he just needed a start. He said he was family. I sat on the porch of our father's house while he said all of that. The same porch where our father had been sitting on the day I came home with the diagnosis news still ringing in my head. The wooden boards under my feet were the boards I had repainted myself the previous summer because they had been peeling and Dad had been too tired to do it. The wind chime over my head was the same wind chime my mother had hung over 20 years ago. I let him finish. Then I told him no. I did not yell. I did not list every reason. I told him I forgave him. I told him I was glad he had said the word sorry. I told him I would not be sending money. I told him I had spent 3 years giving everything I had to a parent who had asked for none of it, and that I had used my legal winnings to put new tires on the shop truck and a new roof on the house. and that the last thing our father had wanted was for any of that to flow back to a son who had treated him like a future problem to be managed. I told him I wished him well and that I meant it and that he was free to send a card on holidays if he wanted, and that I would not be sending one back. Then I told him I had to go and I hung up the phone. He has not called since. I want to tell you what I learned because I do not think you stayed with me through this story for a fight. I think you stayed because something in this story sounded familiar to you. Maybe you are the daughter who stayed home. Maybe you are the son who took the calls. Maybe you are the one who sat with the hospital pamphlets while everyone else made plans for after. Maybe you have been told your whole life that the way to keep a family together was to not make trouble. Maybe you are afraid that if you tell the truth, the people who never showed up will paint you as the problem. I want you to hear something from me plainly the way my aunt told it to me on the day of the verdict. Loyalty without honesty is just silence. A family that asks you to be silent to keep the peace to let the absent ones rewrite the story is not asking for loyalty. It is asking for a free pass on its end behavior, and you do not have to give it. I think a lot now about that video my father made. I think about how strange it must have felt for him, 69 years old in a clean blue plaid shirt, to look into a camera and explain why he had to record himself like this. I think about how he must have known even then that I would one day need it more than I could imagine. I think about how he protected me from beyond his own grave by spending a single afternoon being honest. I think about how it cost him almost nothing, but how 2 years later it saved everything I had left. That is the lesson I keep coming back to. Truth, said clearly while you can still say it, is a kind of love. It is one of the most useful kinds of love we have. It is harder than silence. It costs more in the moment, but silence does not protect anyone in the end. Silence is what people use to avoid hard moments while leaving the next person to clean them up. Truth, written down, said out loud, recorded, witnessed, signed, is what protects the people you love after you cannot protect them yourself. I run the shop now. I live in the house. I still wake up sometimes around 3 a.m. and listen for footsteps from the back bedroom, even though I know there are not going to be any. I keep my father's photograph, the same one that was behind him in the video, on the same table in the living room. The green chair is still there. I sit in it sometimes on cold nights with a blanket and I think about him. I do not feel hatred for Bryce. I do not feel pity for him either, the way I once did. I feel, more than anything, settled. I know what I did. I know what he did. I know what our father wanted. I know I honored him. There is no part of me that needs anyone else's agreement for any of that. When people in town hear pieces of this story, the part they always ask about is the moment in the courtroom. They want to know what it felt like when the judge set down his pen. I tell them the truth. It did not feel like winning. It felt like being heard for the first time in a very long time. That is what justice felt like in that room, not a celebration. A long, cold breath of being finally believed. If you have ever lived under a lie about your own life that the people closest to you were happy to tell, you already know exactly what kind of breath I mean. The shop sign, the new one with the line that says third generation owned, has a small detail most people do not notice. Below the year 1982 there is a tiny mark, a dot the painter put there by mistake. I asked her to leave it. It looks like a small period at the end of a sentence. I look at it sometimes in the morning when I unlock the front door of the shop. I think of it as the period at the end of the sentence my father started in 1982, and that I am still writing. I think of it as a quiet promise. A promise that the next time someone tries to tell my story for me, I will already have written it down myself. Aunt Linda comes for dinner most Sundays. Greg is teaching Lucia how to weld. Dale got married last spring. I helped pay for his suit because his own father had passed 2 years before. Mr. Halloran retired in the summer and his daughter took over his practice. Mrs. Patel sent a card on the first anniversary of my father's death and wrote 3 sentences inside it that I kept in a drawer. The shop is busy. The house is warm. The porch boards still need sweeping. I sweep them now without complaining, the way my father used to. I think he would like that. If my brother ever drives back into Glen Hollow, he will find a town that still remembers our father, a shop that still bears our last name, and a sister who's no longer afraid of him. He will not find a fight. He will not find revenge. He will find a closed door, a polite smile, and a woman who learned in a courtroom in late autumn that the strongest answer to a lie is not noise. It is the careful, prepared, undeniable shape of the truth, sitting calmly on the table, waiting to be opened. That is the day I stopped being the daughter who tried to keep the peace. That is the day I became the daughter who told the truth instead. And I have not gone back. I will not go back. There is no version of my life left in me that asks the wrong people for permission to be respected. Not anymore, not after that video, not after that pen. Not after my father's voice on a screen in a public courtroom, reaching from the past to remind a courtroom full of strangers that he had always known exactly who his daughter was. If you stayed with me all the way to the end, thank you. I want to ask you one more thing before you go. If your own family had stood in a courtroom and accused you of something cruel that you did not do you think you would have fought back, or would you have paid them off just to keep the peace at the next holiday table? I'm not asking that as a test. I'm asking because I think a lot of people are still living quiet versions of that question in dinners and group chats and family meetings and have never said the answer out loud. Tell me in the comments where you would have drawn the line and what you wish someone had told you the first time your kindness was used against you. I will read every comment, and if this story spoke to something in you, follow along because Ackles still has more truth to tell.